There are few icons of horror like the vampire. From mosquitoes to ticks to blood-sucking lawyers, the image of the vampire pervades popular culture and has continually changed throughout its history. Sometimes seductive, sometimes a shapeshifter, and sometimes a grotesquely attractive white suburban teenager, the vampire is always rooted in the mixing of blood, the question of immortality, and a concern about religious purity. Because the vampiric image has been so malleable, its various representations offer an opportunity for cultural analysis. Is it a stand-in for colonization by the West? Is it a worry about racial purity and the mixing of cultures? Is it a temptation of lust and immortality? Is it an Ubermenchian mechanism for generating new values in a cultural vacuum?
In this episode, we cover three major movements in vampire narratives. In the first part of the show, we are joined by Chris McAuley, co-creator of the popular multimedia StokerVerse, to discuss Bram Stoker's Dracula, how it manifests in role-playing games, and some secrets hidden in lost manuscript pages. Next, we turn our attention to Stephen King's vampiric masterpiece, Salem's Lot, and analyze its relation to Dracula, how the famous count might show up differently in the US, and what this says about small-town America. Finally, we take up the recent Netflix limited series Midnight Mass, created by Mike Flanagan, and question whether this is a version of Salem's Lot, how the simplification of stories helps us to see broader connections, and how Christian nationalism looks a lot like the community of Crockett Island. Join us as we explore the creaking coffins of vampiric narratives. Make sure to bring along your best silver and your favorite steak, but keep an eye on the horizon, lest we let the sun go down before we're done. This is Horror Joy, a podcast about the emotional and intellectual joys of horror. We're your hosts. I'm Jeff Stoyanoff, Assistant Professor of English at Penn State Altoona.
I'm Brian Onishi, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Penn State Altoona.
All right. Welcome, everyone. So today, Brian and I have with us Dr. Chris McAuley, who is the inventor or the writer of StokerVerse, a RPG role-playing game that we'll probably be talking about a bit, among other things. So, Chris, you've told us you have multi-interests here, many of which intersect with horror in a way. So thank you for joining us today. But we want to begin with our usual question. Where do you see the intersection of joy and horror?
It's fun. It's all about imaginative fun, I think. It takes a hell of a lot to scare me. I'll go back in time. When I was a child and I was riding a push bike to the library, I would always check out the Stephen King books and the Clive Barker books, because I always wanted to be scared, because I always found that the fun part of it. Nothing ever really scared me. So I suppose that's why I decided to start writing horror, to see if I could scare other people. But yeah, I think it's fun. I think it's, that's where it's ace for me.
That's fantastic. So I guess maybe to push that question in the direction of StokerVerse, why Bram Stoker? Why vampires? Why an RPG?
Yeah, well, I'll give you, I'll go back in time and go to school. And at the back of my school library, there was this book called Dracula, which my parents forbade me to read because they're very religious people. And, I think they thought if I read this piece of horror, I would be somehow completely corrupted. And people say that. They don't really understand Dracula when they say that. When I read the book, I saw a lot of elements of light in Dracula, as Van Helsing talks about Mina being the light of lights. That's what it's really about. There's light and darkness. Now, the Stokerverse stuff happened when Decker Stoker, who is Bram Stoker's great-grandnephew, came to me after reading one of my Dracula comics. I'd written it. It's called Dracula, Lord of the Future, and it was a sci-fi thing. And he really enjoyed it, so he came to me and he said, can we team up and start writing some graphic novels? And it was, looking at Bram Stoker's short stories. And I loved Bram Stoker's work when I was at university, so I went to Trinity University in Dublin, which is where Bram and Oscar Wilde, his friend Oscar Wilde, studied. And I've read most of Bram's stories and novels, and a lot of them aren't horror related at all. A lot of them are mostly drama and suspense and things like that. But we started with the very unfortunately titled, and I do have to apologise for this, The Squaw, which I renamed The Version's Embrace because it's about the version of Nuremberg. And we took that text, we took family insight, we took notes from Bram's journal, and we created this graphic novel. And then that became very popular, and then it spiraled into a Dracula audio series, an all-star audio series. It then spanned into a novel called Dracula's Bedlam. It then became an RPG series. It became a miniature word game series, and now a video game and card game and a TV show that's in the works at the minute. So all of that kind of happened. So I co-created the StokerVerse with Dagger, and it's been 3 years now. I think it's about 3 years old, everything.
That's fantastic. So I was looking before we started recording through the graphic novel, the one you shared with us, and it is just really fantastic to see how you all are bringing to life these stories with the graphic elements, right? So one thing Brian and I have been wanting to talk more about on the podcast, but haven't quite yet, are our comics, our graphic novels. We talked briefly about one of the new brief short comics from Epitaphs from the Abyss out of, I think, Boom Comics, Senator. And that was in our Christian nationalism episode. I'm curious, so as a genre, what about the graphic novel do you think appeals to fans of horror? What makes it specifically good at conveying horror? Is it the images, or is it just like the multimedia?
Yeah, I think it's the storytelling aspect of it, is through the image and through text. You know, I'll just segue slightly. For a writer, it's wonderful to have an artist, and both of us are storytellers, right? So you have that synthesis between the artistic storytelling and the literary storytelling. And, I'm a big comic book geek, have been since I was a kid, used to read 2000 AD, all that stuff. But it's the imagination of the artist, I think, really appeals, and this is why I love the media of comic books and graphic novels. It's the visual imagery, and there's a surrender that a writer has to have to the artist. I've just finished this project called Shadows of the StokerVerse, which is actually a book. It's a book, but it's illustrated by Clint Langley, and Clint Langley is a very well-known UK comic book artist and Warhammer 40k artist. And we had an interesting synthesis with that, where Clint would sometimes paint an image, and then I would write a story about the image, which is a little different, right? And then I would write something, and then Clint would paint it. But Clint became so obsessed with the StokerVerse and so obsessed with the stories that he started to paint creatures on the walls of his house, which I'm not sure how that went down with his significant other. But he painted this like rather grotesque looking Spider Woman with an open vagina and all sorts of things. And that's sitting in his room in the bedroom watching him, as he sleeps.
That feels very Renfield.
Doesn't it? But it's interesting how art and language with graphic novels, they really combine. So yeah, that's what it is for me, that sort of magic synthesis.
Yeah, that's great. I guess then to speak to the RPG, but also you talked about miniatures, and I'm assuming with the miniatures, you said it's in the war games sort of mode, like a Warhammer style.
Yep.
And I know you said there's a video game, and so this project's seen a number of iterations, and there's the forthcoming TV series, which you said we can't really talk about much, but I'm excited. I'm curious to know more. I won't ask, so you don't have to get yourself in trouble, but I will eagerly await finding out more about that as we can. With RPGs, role-playing games, one of the things that Brian and I have discussed, one of the issues that come up time and again against role-playing games would be something like the Satanic Panic with the Dungeons and Dragons history of this. I know you say you come from a religious family. I was raised Catholic. I think I'm supposedly a lapsed Catholic or something to that effect. I know that when my brother began playing Dungeons and Dragons in junior high school, my parents were a little bit wary of it. They didn't know what to think, and they thought, they were going to somehow open doorways to the devil coming in or evil like that. It didn't happen, as it turns out. So surprise, listeners, that did not happen.
That's disappointing.
Yeah, right? I mean, that's
false advertising right there. I hope you sued them.
Right. But yeah, so what you're talking about with the artistic expression that we can see with graphic novels, and how we get different takes on the same thing, and how we can take an idea and both have, different folks can have different input and different ideas about how it would work. RPGs, that's kind of what the player does too, right? So you create a framework, and the player is able to create this fiction, and this seems like such a rich universe to be able to build characters in. So could you maybe talk a little bit about just your experience with RPGs and then how this one came about?
Yeah, when I was growing up, again, going back in time to when I was a child, there was a game called Hero Quest. And Hero Quest was a precursor to Fantasy Warhammer. So it was, you had little miniature figures and you had little boards, and you leveled up your character and all this kind of stuff. And that was the first time I sort of played a proto RPG. And then I moved on to playing, I played Rogue Trader, which was the first Warhammer 40k RPG. So I played that. And then, yeah, I just kind of moved on through gaming as a whole in that. Now, the StokerVerse RPG? Why do we have StokerVerse RPG? Well, everything we try and do is to tie authentically back to Bram Stoker. Now, Bram Stoker was obsessed with the theatre. He was the clerk of petty sessions in Ireland. He was quite bored with that position, and he wanted to be a theatre critic. So he did that. He went to the theatre. He wrote pieces for various newspapers and did all this for free. It was a hobby. And then he became the manager of the Lyceum Theatre in London, which is a very famous theatre. It still stands today, very famous, prestigious theatre. So I looked at all of that, and what do you do in an RPG? You become an actor on a sort of a stage, right? So I was chatting to Decker about this, and I said, look, I think an RPG would be great. I think Bram would love to have people play in his world, you know. And obviously we've extended the world out. We've got like werewolves, and we've got characters like Frankenstein's creature. And how we played that was, how would Bram Stoker have written Frankenstein's creature, the whole, you know, how would Bram Stoker have written Miss Havisham? So we've got Miss Havisham, and she's a zombie in the RPG. So we do all of that sort of stuff, and then we create this wonderful world that is authentically Victorian, all the stuff that went on, the seances and all sorts of things, and we just pepper it with fun stuff. We bring in some of Bram's other bits and pieces in there. Bram wrote a cosmic horror story called Jewel of 7 Stars, which is all about Egypt and mummies and all sorts of things. And I think there was a 1970s horror film that Christopher Lee was in, which was based off it. But we bring that into the RPG as well. So it was just this great way of crafting a world where you could touch Bram's characters and touch that. I termed StokerVerse as a gothic Hellraiser environment, and that was the reason why we went down the RPG route, because I think Bram would have got a kick out of it.
Yeah, so you started talking about the gothic there a bit, and this is a topic we've touched on a few times on the pod. I'm curious how you see horror and the gothic intermingling. Like, how do they work together? Are they the same thing? Is one the setting for the other? So if you have any thoughts on that, just to curious. I'm curious.
Yeah, well, horror is very broad. I mean, if you look at Lovecraftian horror, that's one thing, and I've written a lot of Lovecraftian horror. And, you know, with Lovecraft, you have two things that you can do when you encounter the old gods. You either go crazy or you kill yourself. That's it. When you are faced with that, there's not much else you can do. The Gothic's slightly different, because the Gothic is quite broad. Again, it's a broad term within horror. You know, you have the creepy Gothic, and you've got the quite sinister, subversive sexual Gothic. You've got the Gothic, which is quite blasphemous, all of that sort of stuff. And I think it just ties into what horror is as a whole. Now, how I interpret Gothic horror within Dracula is that it's quite gruesome. There's a wonderful part in Dracula, and I shouldn't say wonderful because it's terrible, but it's where the women are on Jonathan Harker, and then Dracula appears, flings them off, and then gives them this baby to eat. And how I always say is that Jonathan Harker's, you know, in this sort of fever delirium, and he's watching this, and this child's crying and screaming, and these women just pull the child apart as if it's a piece of KFC chicken, and then start to consume it. That is bloody gruesome, dark, gothic horror there. Meanwhile, the mother of the child's outside banging on the door. You bastard, where's my child? And then Dracula gleefully summons the wolves to also feed. There's a nice symmetry there as well. And then you have the high Gothic, where it's the crypt scenes with Lucy, the subversive sexual aspects. So Lucy's an interesting character because, unlike Coppola's version, Lucy is actually in the human state. She's actually she's paragon of virtue in some ways. There's a line that is often quoted whenever she's talking to Mina about, Mina, why can't I just marry these 3 men? Well, that's not because she's promiscuous. What Lucy's looking for is a suitable father for her child. So she's looking at Seward. Seward's the dedicated doctor, who's the caring person. You have Quincy Morris, who's a dashing adventurer. And then you've got Holmwood, who's got the money and the breeding. And she sees something good in all of these men. You see the obsession that Lucy has with children when she becomes the Bluefer lady and she's taking the children. That's what a lot of people get slightly wrong in that interpretation in the original novel. But when she becomes the vampire, it's a negation of that Lucy. And that's the subversive sexual gothic theme, where she puts herself fully on display for the 3 suitors. And that's whenever her slightly more innocent remark to Mina becomes interpreted in a completely different way. And that's why Dracula is a work of genius, because there are these little moments of symmetry that Bram puts into the novel. And I'm not even sure if it was intentional, because I think there's a lot of psychosexual drama that was going on within Bram himself while he was writing the novel. But that would be my interpretation of the Gothic. And then if you look at Frankenstein again is that religious subversion of Victor Frankenstein almost being Luciferian in the way, where I shall ascend heaven and I shall storm the gates and I will create in my own image and I shall do this and I shall do that. And then the hubris that comes with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating answer. And I think that one thing that I thought about when you were talking about Lucy as a kind of paragon of virtue is the flip happens too, because she's really sick and there has to be these transfusions of blood. And at one point, Van Helsing points this out. He's like, hey, you were going to give blood because this was your betrothed or whatever, like that you were going to marry this woman. But we all gave her blood. So it's kind of like we were all married to her. And that's not exactly what Van Helsing's saying, but I feel like that kind of relationship of what happens to Lucy becomes very strange in, like you're saying, a kind of subversive way. I wanted to ask you about the kind of religious background of Dracula, specifically because, yeah, growing up in the church, there was maybe even a kind of comfort in the horror genre, because more than any other, it requires that, at least supernatural horror, you accept that there's a non-physical kind of realm. And so it's like, look, yeah, this is kind of scary, gruesome stuff. Babies are getting torn apart, but there's also the sense in which, oh, what are we going to do? We're going to fight off Dracula with our crosses and with our holy water and with our religious belief or something like that. So you have mentioned that you have a academic background, a PhD in theology. I'm curious if you have insight into the religious background of Dracula. I mean, obviously, I think that's probably a really big topic. So if there's a kind of version of that you'd be willing to give us, that would be awesome. Yeah. Well, hard to do. I'd put you on the spot here.
Well, being Irish, I'm probably haven't swallowed the Blarney Stone, let alone kissed it. It can be very difficult. Anyway, right. Let's start from the beginning. Bram Stoker was a religious man. Bram Stoker was born in Ireland during a very turbulent time where there was basically wars against both Catholics and Protestants. And he tried to find a way beyond that. He studied the Bible. He believed in Christianity. He was brought up Anglican, so Episcopalian. I think that's the way that translates in the New World of America. But he had great friendships with Roman Catholics, and he loved what I term the smells and bells. He loved all of that, the rituals and all those kind of things, right? So later on in life, he became a Freemason like myself. And what he found with Freemasonry was that there was this mythology that was biblical but also older. And there were older meanings behind things. And then he, I believe, went into the Order of the Golden Dawn with various other Freemasons. And he was looking for the depth of of Kabbalistic knowledge and Gnosticism and things like that. Now, that all gets translated into Dracula in a very interesting way. So why are vampires afraid of the cross? Well, the cross is the equinox of the sun. When Christ is crucified on the cross and he dies, the sun disappears. And you know, the Knights Templar, there was a charge laid against them where they stamped and trampled on the cross. Well, actually, no, what they were doing was they were moving their feet in time with the equinox. They were actually talking about the Earth being heliocentric rather than the universe being geocentric, which was very subversive back in those days. So he knew all of this, and he was peppering this into Dracula. Now, I love the character of Van Helsing because he's pretty crazy. I think he's driven mad with the burden of knowledge that he has. And he knows all of this stuff. He has to try and explain this to guys who are neophytes and try and explain it in a way that it's palatable. All of this mysticism and all of that. And if you go and read the book and understand that Bram Stoker was a Christian, was somebody who believed in the death and resurrection of Christ and believed in the majority of the church's teachings, you see the light within Bram Stoker, and you see the light within the band of heroes, essentially. So Decker lives in North Carolina. He goes over to Ireland regularly, because Bram Stoker was Irish, and he went to the gravesite of Bram Stoker. And as they were at the Catholic Church, they were doing a ceremony. And the priest held in one hand up the Bible and the other hand Dracula as he was going down the aisle. And Decker asked the priest, is that not very blasphemous? And the priest said, no. They're both stories about light conquering darkness. And that's very true of the original novel. Dracula is a horrendous individual. He's not a sexy character at all in the book. He is defeated several times by the goodness of the heroes. You know, there's that infamous scene where Dracula has taken his dirty, long fingernail, cuts himself open, and blood and pus are running out, and he takes Mina and slams her head to his chest like an unholy communion. The band of heroes breaks in. He looks at Harker, leers at him, shows him his wife's face, and then flings Mina from him. And it's almost to say, do you want her now? And what people don't catch in the book is all the rest of them are all holding up their crosses and flinging holy water at Dracula. What does he do? He goes straight to his wife. Yes, he does want her, and he cleans her face. And again, that shows good defeating evil. And there's that reoccurring pattern within Dracula. Ford Coppola kind of subverted that a little bit at the end, where, Mina didn't say, oh, thank God, that monster's dead. Oh, no, it's like, oh, poor Dracula. He had reasons to be bad. He had reasons to be bad. And again, it's that humanizing of the monster that you see so often in Hollywood. But it's not present within Dracula at all. Maybe apart from one line where he says, you two know that I have loved, but we don't know what that love really was in that context. But yes, that there is a significant religious aspect to Dracula.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really like the conversation you had about the way that the cross works, not only in Christianity, but as a reflection of the fear of the sun generally in the mythology. And I think that that's actually a question that I've been having about Salem's Lot, for example. Why is the vampire afraid of the cross? Because there's things to say about that. But I think your answer actually really helps provide insight to that. I wanted to go back to the RPG just because I think that there's something so fascinating about the universe that you've built, right? You've built this kind of incredible multimedial universe that engages people at different levels, from the graphic novel to the prose novel to RPGs and video games. And I think that the RPG is so fascinating because it requires that players explicitly take up a world together. So there's this kind of circling back to what have you done as the horror creator? You've generated a universe, you've generated a world. But now people that are playing this game are able to not only enter the world that you've created, but also do the work to generate, right? Which is something that happens in reading. Anytime you take up art, I think you do this. But RPGs almost explicitly require that the imaginative process or the imaginative project of the group that are playing take up the world together. And so I love that you've kind of, Jeff mentioned opening worlds and summoning the devil, but you've opened worlds in many ways that allow both worlds to bleed into ours and our world to bleed into others, and for the expansion of the worlds via the imagination. I think that's incredible. So I'm not sure there's a question there, but I love that project.
So it's still ongoing. There's another new book coming out this year. I've written several RPGs, like from Terminator, which is one of my favorite sci-fi horror properties, and I've written, I think, 7 RPGs now, even Christmas RPGs. So I do that. There's a very interesting tabletop game that we've just revealed called Dr. Frankenstein's Monster Mayhem. It's a family game. It's a dice rolling game, but it's basically you play as one of 4 mad inventors, and you have to build your own monster. So each side of the dice has a little part of a monster, so you can build literally mix and match monsters. So you can build your own Frankenstein's creature, you can build your own Medusa, you can build your own, or you can just mix and match them. Now it's meant for families and for kids from the ages of like 4 to 8. Now where this came about, you talk about opening up worlds. I always heard Decker when he was on the phone with me playing with his grandkids, and I realised I have not created anything for Decker to play with his grandkids to pass on the Stoker legacy. So I come up with this sort of family orientated game, which very simple to play, but fun, and I love that sort of opening the StokerVerse up now to a non-threatening. It's a non-threatening StokerVerse. It's very fun. It's there's monsters, but they're all very friendly monsters. And I'm actually in the process of writing the children's book that accompanies it. And I've written children's books, and today's quite monumental because my first children's comic book from Cosby Media, the cover was revealed. It's actually a sci-fi mech thing. Anyway, I'm digressing on that. But opening up worlds is very important to me whenever I create franchises or I'm involved with franchises. Now, if I'm involved in a franchise that's not mine, I respect the rules of that franchise. I don't try and break those, and I try and go to the core or the heart of the franchise. So with Terminator, it's very much body horror, concentration camps, fear of the tech noir, fear of the darkness of technology and what that is. Star Trek was exploration, adventure, but the deep loneliness of space. I was writing an original series, so I saw a lot of that deep loneliness of space in there too, and the weight that's on starship captains. But when it's my own stuff, I just go, okay, let's just go with it. Let's just do something that creates something that's fun.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Dr. Frankenstein's Kickstarter page right now. This looks really fun, actually. This is like something I could play with my nephews and nieces and not have to do explaining to their parents about why they're having nightmares or some such.
Well, there'll be no demons. I have to say this now. There's no demons going to get released from any of my games. So, it's not that. The RPG, going back to the RPG very quickly, Decker was very surprised because there was a game that ran where we have a quick start, which basically is a sequel to Dracula, which is a campaign. It's 110 pages or something like that, and you can play as one of the band of heroes. And Decker was very surprised whenever in one game, one person who was playing Jonathan Harker decided to go crazy and start shooting everybody with a shotgun. He took out Mina, he took out Quincy before I think he was put down by the other players. And that just shows what you can do in those games. You can just do what you want,
There was something really interesting you were saying there, Chris, about world building, but also like creation and creativity and how these games allow that for the players. Something Brian and I have touched on in other episodes. We just did an episode on aliens. We were talking about this intersection of science fiction and horror. But I'm curious, since you're working in all of these different genres, really, science fiction and horror. Science fiction and fantasy, to me, often are thought of perhaps now in 2024 in higher regard than horror by a public general audience, right? I think horror should not be considered less than anything, but often it is as a genre, right? Like it's looked down upon, whether it's literarily, whether it's in film. A lot of people, I don't watch horror movies. Like I don't do that. And maybe it's because they misunderstand what horror is. They think of what we have lovingly begun to call torture porn. So something like Saw or Hostel. So, I mean, I wonder, what are your thoughts on some of the public's general reluctance to embrace the fun creativity we can all work together with in horror, as opposed to some of these other genres?
Where I see it, there's a lot of very badly written horror. And that's part of the problem. And it's really, horror writers have got to up their game a bit. And I think there's also a problem with how we pigeonhole the genre. It's everything's horror. Saw's horror. The Hammer stuff's horror. It's all, well, yeah, it is, but there are other aspects of horror that might suit different groups of people. And I think it's trying to explain that genre and that genre difference. But I was very lucky to win the Reggie Bannister Award for something about, what I did in horror literature. But it was interesting to be given that award by a horror film icon from the Phantasm films. And, I had a sort of a chat at the time, and I had never seen the Phantasm films. So movie horror isn't really my thing. I'm more into literary horror. But I went and watched the Phantasm films and thought they were great fun. I then watched the Nightmare on Elm Street films and thought the first one was amazing. This dream demon that stalks people. Later, as they get on, they're a little bit more... Actually, I find them more disturbing, with his mum being a nun and the scenes that go on in the asylum and all of that sort of stuff. It's very disturbing, very powerful, and then intermixed with the humour. So I quite liked it. I thought I gave it a chance. But the horror films I enjoy the most are probably the folk horror films, like The Witch, all of that stuff. There's a power that horror has that it settles on you, and then it's very hard to forget that sort of stuff. Cronenberg's Rabid was one of those. Cronenberg's work I find extremely disturbing because it's all about metamorphosis and change. And if you want to look at that through literature, Kafka did exactly the same thing. And, all of that sort of stuff is I think, part of our classic literary traditions. If you look at mythologies, if you look at the Iliad, for example, transformation there, the horror that's there, the folk horrors in the Iliad as well. It's all there. We just have to become more articulate about it. And I think as writers, we have to up our game. And it's not that I'm a gatekeeper, but there's a lot of crap horror out there. And I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, something that Brian brought up earlier, and then you just touched on again, is you talked about folk horror, but the supernatural elements of horror, what I'm hearing in your response there is those are the things that really interest you, where we see the supernatural presenting itself, manifesting, and how horrors are maybe a gateway into seeing that. For me, one of the things I love about horror is it does require a sort of faith, in the sense that there is something, as Brian said earlier, beyond this world. And with Dracula, you see that for sure. When you were talking earlier about how you saw that interplay between Dracula and religion, to me, in many ways, Dracula almost is a Christ figure in a way, but inverted, like a backwards image, if you will.
You've actually hit the nail on the head. Whenever Bram Stoker originally wrote Dracula, it wasn't called Dracula at all, it was called The Undead. I've been very privileged to have Bram Stoker's notes and to go through them and see the original typescript of Dracula. And he wanted Dracula to be the devil on earth. So you still catch that in the original novel where he signs for Carfax Abbey as Count Mandevil. It's a play on words, right? But when he went to the London, his editor, Otto Kleiman from Archibald and Constable, the publishers, he said, no, you've got to have something that has one word on it. Catchy one word. And he went to the London Library, and Decker verified Bram Stoker's writing. Bram Stoker just defaced books in the library. There you go. He just defaced the books, and he was underlining things and all the rest of it. But he found this book by Emily Gerard called The Land Beyond the Forest, which is actually the English translation of Transylvania. And she writes about all the superstitions and all the rest of it. And he saw this, Dracula, son of the devil, and he went, I'm going to use that. And that's why in chapter 2 of Dracula, whenever you've got Jonathan Harker chatting to the Count's got all these strange origin stories everywhere. It's not really Vlad III because it was never meant to be Vlad III. It was, Bram just wanted to use the Transylvanian part and the Dracula word and that sort of atmosphere because he loved that. The castle that Bram drew from was not Bram Castle in Romania. It was actually a Scottish castle called in Cruden Bay. Now the castle in Cruden Bay is ruins now, but Bram during its heyday would have gone there and been a dinner guest. And there's an octagonal room in there, and you see that reference within the novel. So it's interesting where we look at the origins of Dracula. Very much he was meant to be the Antichrist figure, or the son of the devil. He was meant to be the devil on earth. There were 120 pages removed from the original Dracula, which the StokerVerse are using to bring back the original Dracula. That's actually one of the USPs. So I've seen this and I've been working with that, and I've put it into the games and I put it into the comic books and all these kind of things. And there's interesting scenes there where... So Dracula's not coming to England for a booty call. He's not coming to find a new wife. He's coming to take over the Victorian Empire. This is what he really wants to do. So he comes in and he's a nobleman. Why he wants Carfax Abbey? It's to own a estate. It's to own land, to be accepted. So he's brought in some of these missing pages, and I need to be careful what I say here, but he has intellectual discourse with other noblemen, and he extols violent socialist revolution. because he believes in the Nietzschean concepts of the Übermensch. Now, when Nietzsche talked about the Übermensch, he warned that once you remove moral and ethics from society, whether it's mythological or philosophical, you will have an Übermensch. You will have somebody who will come and start to create his own sense of morality. And that's exactly what Dracula's doing. So there you go. So you hit the nail right in the head there.
I love that analysis. I thought about Nietzsche too when you were talking about Van Helsing as the madman from the gay science, just in the sense that he's got all this knowledge and he is speaking in many ways outside the kind of realm of rationality for the other people that are trying to kind of wrap their heads around everything going on. And so he has to be careful, but he also comes across as a kind of mad person because he is speaking from a different kind of rationality. I wanted to ask you, one of the things that I've written about is this worry that Dracula, and you kind of called it a booty call, right? He's not coming to just kind of seduce people, right? I think in the Coppola film, there's this sense in which Dracula is kind of seductive. In the novel, it doesn't seem like that's the case. However, one reading, and we've talked to somebody named Lucas Kwong on this show, who talks about this a little bit too, but I've written about this in the sense that, okay, the mixing of blood and the way that the kind of British Empire was working at the time, there was a concern about maybe immigration or some other kind of, I don't know, race or whatever it might be coming in and taking over. So Dracula represents the threat of the other, even on a political space. But what I like about what you're saying is that that might be true, but it's also could be true that this is a kind of Ubermenschian overtake. The values, right? Again, the madman in the gay science says, we've killed God. And what that means is that the values that we think we have are actually devoid. We've lost our values. And so now there's a vacuum. The Ubermensch, Dracula, maybe comes in and says, here's the new set of values that we need to take up. I think that's fascinating. But I mean, I don't know if you had thoughts about that kind of other reading.
Yeah, I've looked at that. And that's actually one of the common readings of Dracula from a colonial standpoint. And I'm looking at Dracula from a very different lens than other people, but every lens is valid, because if you find something in that story that resonates with you or the struggle you're going through, when you look at, there are two great evils. One is that man recreates God in his own image, or man kills God. Those are the two great evils. Now, whatever God is, and I don't lay claim to any knowledge of God or anything like that, but when we remove any sort of sense of higher judgment or higher morality, and whether that exists within ourselves or not, it becomes very dangerous. But that's the Übermensch, that's the danger of Dracula. Did you know that Bram Stoker said that Dracula was a true story? In the original prologue of Dracula.
I did not know that.
Yeah, in the original prologue. Why the 120 pages? In the original prologue of Dracula, Bram Stoker said that Dracula was a true story, and that he knew everybody, and they were all prominent members of Victorian society, and their names had to be changed. When he told Otto Kleiman that it was a true story, Otto Kleiman refused. He said no. He read through the book, and he said, you must remove 120 pages of this book and rewrite the book. So the Dracula you had to take off the shelf is not the real Dracula. It's not the original at all. So that's actually one of the reasons that we created the StokerVerse. We're trying to do that. In Dracula Return issue 2, we actually reveal who Dracula really was, and he was somebody that Bram Stoker knew. If you want to find out who that was, you have to buy issue 2.
I like that. It's a kind of maybe, the kind of epistolary form of Dracula is, it feels like a little bit of found footage that reminds me of maybe a kind of found footage setup. This is real. Or we just talked about the Blair Witch, right? That kind of feel to it. Obviously, much further back than any of these films are being produced. I was going to ask, is there anything recently that you found, any horror that you found joy in?
Probably Warhammer 40k. I've discovered Warhammer 40k for the first time. I played Space Marine 2 and went, oh, okay, there's a little bit of cosmic horror in this. This is great. So I went back, got some of the books, got some of the comics. I can reveal that I've written Warhammer 40k. I've had 2 stories accepted now from Black Library for 40k. And they delve into body horror and all of that kind of stuff. And I think 40k is essentially sort of a space opera horror. And again, shows how genres blend in unique ways. And horror actually, I think, is part of the backbone of science fiction. And horror is part of the backbone of fantasy. Go to science fiction and there's horror there, there's horror elements there of deep space and what happens. And that's the most interesting parts of science fiction. Fantasy's the same, creatures, the mythologies, the monsters. That's got the half backbone of horror. Yeah, anyway, that's my answer.
That's fantastic. I love that, thinking about horror as the backbone for both of those genres. It makes me wonder if those genres in some ways are maybe actually a subgenre of horror, but that's probably a conversation for a different day. I think at this point, Chris, thank you so much for talking with us, for sharing all of this. We look forward to seeing where the StokerVerse universe is going to go.
Thank you very much.
I am looking forward to seeing where that television series ends up. So we'll keep an eye out. Maybe you'd be willing, if once the TV series is a thing and you're allowed to talk about it, to come back and talk with us about it. We'd love that. But yeah, thank you so much for your time today. We've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks very much, folks.
Bye. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for the time. Appreciate it. All right, y'all. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Chris McAuley, creator of StokerVerse. So much to say about Dracula, vampiric images, video games, role-playing games, the worlds we live in. I love all of that. I think he's such an interesting guy. However, I really want to talk about Salem's Lot. This is a book that I read when I was young and have not picked it up since then, like junior high, I think I read it, and I remember loving it. And so I'm excited to talk about it. Jeff, you recently read this, I think for the first time, or you listened to it. I also re-listened to it. The audiobook is great if you have a chance, if you're an audiobook listener. But you kind of read this for the first time, and it seemed like you really loved it. We talked to Tom Dede about it. This has been such a huge part of a lot of people's horror journeys. And so I'm curious, what drew you to Salem's Lot first, but what was it about Salem's Lot that you liked? Big ideas in the text. What did you think?
Yeah, I did listen to it. And I know we did talk about with Tom Dede a little bit of Salem's Lot, but namely King's introduction, his preface is fantastic. Like if you've never read Salem's Lot, never listened to Salem's Lot on an audiobook, like Brian alluded to how I consumed it, at least get the copy of the book to look at King's introduction. It's just a great little narrative talking about his origin story almost as a writer, how good parenting is letting your children read bad literature. And this is what his mom calls stuff trash, but then there was trash, and then there was trash, or like bad trash. And I think that's fantastic. So we get to see a little bit of how King is formed as in that narrative. And it's an homage to his mom, really. And it's touching in that way. But as far as Salem's Lot goes, I mean, I've seen the 1970s made for TV movie, and I'd never read the book. And I remember looking at that, just thinking back to that movie, having rewatched that movie maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, and then seeing the remake that was coming out on Max, I figured I probably should finally read this book. And listeners, if you work in teaching, either as high school, elementary school, college, as teachers, we do a lot of reading. And sometimes your eyeballs just get tired. And so one of the ways that I found around that Brian actually introduced me to is listening to audiobooks more frequently. And so went over to Audible and found a version of Salem's Lot to listen to while I was doing other things on the computer, around the house, whatever. And it's a very long audiobook. Many, many hours of joy ensued. It's well written. It's a vampire story. Spoiler alert, it's a vampire story. So going in, there's going to be vampires. And having seen the movie, I kind of had a general idea of how the plot works out. But the book does a much nicer job of tying everything together, of situating characters, of giving Jerusalem's Lot, which they shorthand Salem's Lot, which is endearing when you find that out, to me anyway. It's their nickname for the town they live in. And you sort of imagine a sign that's begun to wear a bit. So maybe that's part of it too. And there's the allusion to Salem witch trials. There's so many things, even just in the name. It was very enjoyable to get to see the more fully fleshed out universe of Salem's Lot. Very 70s-tastic in its way. You can tell King is writing this in the 70s, published in 75. There's a lot of Americana nostalgia. Even though I didn't live in that time period, I can feel it. Even though I would say Anne Rice is probably our author to turn to when we're looking at queer vampires, or how vampires are on the borders of sexuality, where you have a lot of sort of queer coded gay vampire stuff that goes on. probably with the sucking of blood and all of that. That's something that I guess you don't see in Bram Stoker's Dracula, but we definitely get the sense of that here, where it's a very male type thing for at least the vampires. It's almost predatory, and in that way, in retrospect, there is a little bit of Catholic Church discussion to be had there with the predatory nature of vampires preying on younger male boys. It seems the townspeople are awful in some ways. Like I'm having flashbacks to Jaws, our discussion of Jaws and how I am Team Shark. I'm not going to say that I'm Team Vampire in this book, but the people of Salem's Lot are very reminiscent of some of the people in Jaws, to be sure. Seeing how the vampire is absent for so much of the book is great. Like in the sense that we know the vampire's there, we know the vampire's doing things, but we don't actually confront the vampire until towards like the last section of Salem's Lot. And then they're trying to defeat this immortal or otherworldly supernatural force with Matt and Ben. And it's eerie too, because Ben, of course, has returned home after a long time away. And like for me, as someone like who moved away and came back home, like there is a very uncanny sense of place. And I think for us as readers or listeners to this narrative, that helps us align or appreciate Ben's perspective more, because we are like Ben. We're coming back to a place looking at it. And even though he has history here, we're seeing it through his eyes, re-seeing it. So that there's something about that too, I think, with this narrative. Super enjoyable. The ending, sort of surprising in some ways, but also, I mean, it's worth reading this book again for the introduction alone, but also so much of our popular culture discussions around vampires has been shaped by Salem's Lot. There's no doubt about that. And later on this episode, even, we're going to talk about one of those cultural artifacts, Midnight Mass, and how Midnight Mass is definitely in the history of Salem's Lot. So, Brian, I know you got to revisit this recently. Some of your thoughts on this?
I agree with so much of what you're saying. I agree that King's introduction to the novel is incredible. I think King is widely read by a lot of people, but if you don't read Stephen King, I think you think of him as the kind of trash that he talks about having read. And what is always surprising to me is how literate King is. He writes with this knowledge and appreciation of so many authors, and that comes, I think, very clearly through his work. He loves music, he loves literature, he loves all these things. Like he is, I think, an incredible collector and communicator of American culture that I think that doesn't get celebrated enough. This is his second book. So he published Carrie as his first book, and then Salem's Lot as his second book. It's incredible that this is book number 2. I love that even here we get the staples of a lot of King's fiction. You have a writer, right? He's writing from his own experience, obviously, but there's also, because this is so early in his successful writing career, a main character is also an English teacher. And in the introduction, he talks about being an English teacher and how that plays out in this book. I think English teachers, educators, have an incredible amount of influence over students, which is, I think, why in the United States right now, the Department of Education is being weaponized politically. And that's unfortunate. But I think we see some of that here. So that being said, the Salem's Lot itself, it's weird because I read it and thought, I wish it were longer. I wish that there was more background, because you read something like The Stand, which is just incredibly long. I am a huge advocate of audiobooks. I remember missing out on fiction for a long time after I ended undergraduate because I was too busy. Audiobooks came back to my life, and it was just a huge, huge benefit to me. But I have listened to The Stand probably 3 times in the last 3 or 4 years. And it's huge. It's a long, long audiobook. But the reason why I say that I wish Salem's Lot was longer is because you can be 10 hours in to The Stand and feel like it's just beginning. Somehow King creates these worlds that you want to stay in and live in, and they're so rich that you feel like you're just beginning, even though you're hours and hours into it. Yeah, so there's part of me that wishes there was a little bit more Kurt Barlow. Right in Dracula, you get this kind of weird cycle where you start with Jonathan Harker at the castle of Dracula, and you get this kind of interaction with him. Harker is headed out to the castle, and maybe the coachman is actually Dracula. Whatever, all this stuff is weird. You get this weird introduction to Dracula. You start out with like, oh, this feels a little bit weird. Oh no, this is very sinister. And then we move away. And Dracula doesn't come back until kind of 2/3 of the way into the book again. We don't really get Barlow. We only get Barlow's stand-in in Straker. And I was having a conversation about our Alien episode with somebody and talking about how who's the enemy here? The enemy seems to be the company, but Ash and the Xenomorph are both manifestations of the company. And I think that's true of Straker as well. Straker is like the symptom of the illness that is Dracula or something like that. So we get the first introduction, like you first are introduced to a cold with a sneeze. Straker is our first introduction to the kind of sinister nature of Barlow. And then it just goes from there. It feels underground. It feels insidious, and people don't realize it. And I think that's something that struck me, is it felt like, in some way, if there's a collapse of America, like the collapse of Salem's Lot, it happens slowly. Maybe not slowly, sorry. It happens quickly and happens silently. And people just don't realize that it's happening. And I fear that that's something that's going on, that the death of Salem's Lot is in many ways like the death of America. It seems like nobody's noticing, and it's happening in this kind of insidious way. And we get this pop-up of some kind of thing, and at the end we are shown what we're up against or something like that, right? That might have gone too far a little bit, but anyway, thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm just going to say, like, is Richard Straker Elon Musk, or is Elon Musk Richard Straker? Maybe I'll rescind my previous statement on our last episode that I don't want to go to space, because if that's the case, you all can feel free to collectively yeet me just out of the solar system. I've been told is a more efficient way of getting rid of yourself than into the sun. Apparently it would take way too much energy to yeet someone directly into the sun. Anyway, I digress. Yeah, all of that makes a lot of sense, Brian. Was nodding along emphatically, and listeners can't see that obviously, but when you were talking about how you are left wanting more, even though this book is so long, King has a way of creating universes. I'll agree with you that even though his books are very long, normally, you still leave them feeling like there's so much left to be talked about. For me, this is what I refer to as my It problem, because I have been trying to finish reading Stephen King's It for the better part of a decade. I've been like stuck somewhere around book 2 of It for the better part of probably 5 years now. But I'm just like, part of my mind is still just there in that land, like the land of It and what's going on. And it's not like that I'm enjoying being in this creepy space of that novel, but I kind of am. Like this is something we got to talking to with Chris a bit about, where, and King talks about this in his introduction, that what are we allowed to read? And Bram Stoker's Dracula, for both Chris McAuley and Stephen King, was something that was not refused for Stephen King, but was considered trash or taboo, that he had to go find in the library. Whereas I think Chris said he wasn't allowed to read Dracula originally as a child. So what is it about vampires? What is it about horror that seems to be something that's not allowed? And that's something that we're trying to explore on this podcast. Like there's something subversive about it, and there's something joyful in that subversion. And using this as a way to compare to what we have going on, using Jerusalem's Lot as a foil to the United States of America in our current moment, I don't think it could be more spot on, because how many people are just disconnected, disillusioned, checked out. And that's kind of what happens in Salem's Lot. Like, it's this very small group of people who are all trying to save the village, save the people of the village from Barlow. Half people don't even know what's going on. There's the great scene at the end where they're driving to try to find roses, right? And they go to the first florist that's the closest florist to Salem's Lot, and Straker's already been there. He's already bought all of the roses. So he was one step ahead. Barlow in the end is always one step ahead. And that's the other thing about vampires. I think as supernatural, as horror creatures, they're highly intelligent. And that is really threatening to a lot of people, even the good guys. So when the people who are paying attention are being outsmarted by this being, imagine how much the people who aren't paying attention are being outsmarted by this being, right? And that's, to me, part of the horror in your comparison too, Brian. But anyway, it's a scene. It's such a great scene at the end, because they're trying to find these flowers and they're driving around and they're running out of time. And it seems like you are so invested in this flower narrative because you're in a giant car. It's probably a Buick, knowing King, all traveling to go find these flowers. And then they're foiled immediately. So the canniness of Barlow, I want to say, like, his age is showing, because it's true. Like, he's been around a bit. This isn't his first rodeo, I don't think he would say that, but as we might say. So he's used to foiling humans, and it takes an exceptional bunch of humans to essentially undo or stop what he's trying to do. And just the level of work they have to put in. And to me, I'm listening to it, you're exhausted. You're like, yeah, they have been through the ringer by the end of this book. And then you get the sort of come full circle of the epilogue from what you get in the introduction part, which is great. So Brian, I rambled there a bit, but I'm thinking specifically about, how is this version of Dracula, this version of a vampire, showing us that supernatural smarts?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I wanted to bring in two things. One is the idea that this is a kind of iteration of Dracula, right? So again, from the introduction, we get this idea that what King wanted to do was to imagine what would happen if Dracula was just in the middle of the United States. And I think that's an interesting question. And one thing we don't get is we don't get Van Helsing. Van Helsing is this character that has this long history of understanding lore and brings that to the table. I know exactly what we should do because this is an old country and this is a long history of knowledge. We get this image of the kind of knowledge from Mark, which, because he's read a bunch of like comic books. I think that's really interesting, right? Mark is the bearer of knowledge from an American canon of mythology, which is comic books. Stan Lee was famous for bringing Greek mythology into comic books. So it seems not out of place that the mythology and the ideas of how to get rid of the vampire come from a kid, a young boy who has read comic books. I also think that we talked to Chris about why the vampire is afraid of the cross. At one point, it seems as though Barlow or Straker say that he's much older than the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And so the power of the cross, it's unclear why that holds power over him, why the belief that Father Callahan has holds power over him. So Chris said something about how it is a representation of the sun and how maybe pre-Christian times, the cross represented the sun or something like that. That's interesting to me. I don't have a good answer there. The final thing I want to say, and I'll let you jump in here for the last word on Salem's Lot, is that there's more story for Father Callahan in King's universe. And if for no other reason, you should read the Dark Tower series because Father Callahan shows up. I'll say he doesn't show up until the 5th book. I'm not sure if that's a spoiler or not, but Father Callahan has more life to live in the King universe. So yeah, Jeff, do you have final thoughts on Salem's Lot?
No, I'm interested to see Father Callahan showing up again, though. That's interesting. I did not know that. I think King gets Catholic priests really right when he's describing Father Callahan. And he gets Catholicism right, too, in some fun ways, where it's a religion that is fundamentally about doubt, is how I might put it, and how one sits with doubt and creates faith out of that doubt. Very different from Christian fundamentalism in that way. Which is to say that's Catholicism, not American Catholicism. Let's be clear about that. That's its own separate thing. But I mean, I really enjoyed it. I want to listen to it again, honestly, to catch some things that, one of the benefits of listening to an audiobook is you can listen to it at any point in time. But one of the cons, if you will, pros and cons, the cons would be sometimes when you're listening, you're otherwise distracted as well. So you miss on some things. But yeah, the fact that it's open-ended in the sense that the vampires are still out there is great because loose ends allow for us to come back to the universe. Loose ends allow for other people to take this variation on a theme of Dracula and run with it. And maybe I'll use that, Brian, to segue then into our discussion of Midnight Mass. And this is a series by Mike Flanagan on Netflix. 2021 is when it came out. It is one that I remember we started watching it, my husband and I, when it first came out. Because I think we're doing COVID lockdown or some sense of COVID lockdown still at this point, or coming out of COVID lockdown, who knows, going back into it. And I got 2 episodes in. And this is not a spoiler alert, but this is just, again, one of the weird Jeff Stoyanoff laws of watching film and media. If there's a dog that's gratuitously killed on screen, I usually just turn it off and don't keep going. And I'd forgotten why we stopped watching Midnight Mass until trying to rewatch it because Brian, you had said about maybe we should talk about this series. I got to the end of episode 2. And the spoiler alert, if you don't want to know what happens to the end of episode 2, well, you probably already do. The dog's just like dies and it's kind of gratuitous on screen. And I get why it's there. I remember texting you, Brian, saying, this is why I stopped. And you were like, maybe you should just go on to episode 3 and keep watching. And I was like, oh, what a shocking novel idea. Maybe I could just do that. And so I did. And I'm really happy I did, because this is a fantastic series. It takes a little bit to get going. I don't think it really hits its stride until about episode 4, maybe the end of episode 3. But once it does, like, it is a roller coaster from that point onward, and just really fun take on maybe Salem's Lot, as we're going to discuss here, but definitely an excellent take on vampires and what vampires would look like in the 21st century here in America. So, Brian, I know you're a huge fan of this. I'm going to turn it over to you. Where are we going with all of this?
Man, I just rewatched all of Midnight Mass, and I love this show. I think it's incredible. It is my favorite Mike Flanagan show. We are going to talk spoilers here. If you have not watched it, I cannot recommend the show highly enough. It's just so good. There's so much to say. So at the beginning, we are introduced to Riley. He got drunk and he killed somebody and has had to spend years in prison. And really, the story starts with him going back to the island. But what I think is really interesting is that without feeling preachy and without it feeling forced, there are so many things about American culture in this show. So one, the island has been ruined financially by an oil spill. So we get this sense in which the fossil fuel industry has just ruined these people's lives. And they tried to pay them out, and the people on the island took that payment, and there's a whole storyline about how that worked and where that went. But there's the destruction of the natural ecosystem and the reliance on big companies and how that has just gone incredibly poorly. There is a sheriff who is Muslim and is treated as an outsider. He is an outsider, right? Going back to Jaws, certainly not an islander and certainly not a Christian, which is a big part of this show. And so the treatment of him as both a law enforcement officer and as a Muslim, I think, is very important in the show. I think that maybe the most important thing that this show does is it simplifies the story about vampires, about America, and I'm going to say Christian nationalism. Maybe this is just the way that I'm reading it, but I think that that's a significant part of what's going on here. So I'm going to try to lay that out very, very briefly. Jeff, I want to hear what you have to say about it. So we talked to Kelly J. Baker, and one of the claims that I really love that she makes is that horror simplifies for the sake of demonstrating or revealing the way that the world is working and the horrors in it. So there's so much happening on this island. So not only does Riley Flynn, who spent time in jail, come back to the island, but their priest, Monsignor Pruitt, is also coming back from a trip to Jerusalem, as it were, right? Here we are, Jerusalem's Lot. Instead, we get a younger priest who comes back and says, oh, Father Pruitt is recovering. First, Hamish Linklater, who plays Father Paul, is, I think, incredible. Just an incredible job in this. But, okay, so what happens? We understand, I think starting in episode 4, that Father Paul, as Monsignor Pruitt, got lost in the desert, found his way into a cave, was confronted by some kind of vampiric creature, who he interpreted as an angel. He brings that back to the island, and the angel is now going to save the island and resurrect it. So he has brought the promise of resurrection, make America great again, and it is through the religious beliefs in something that is often horrific. So I think what is so interesting about Midnight Mass is that they explicitly take sides with the vampire. You have this incredible character of Beverly Keene, who is like just the worst version of all the hyper religious, judgmental Christians that you've ever known.
That is the thing about Jesus coming back to us. They told us from the start that it wouldn't be pretty.
She is it. Samantha Sloyan as Bev Keene, I think that's, again, incredible. But ultimately what happens is there is now a demand to be saved. There's miracles that occur, and you are called in to the church because it's going to save you. It's going to resurrect you. And not only that, Beverly Keene and the Catholic Church on the island take this as an opportunity to close off every other thing. So first they start to take away the supplies, and then they start to bring in the Bible into the classroom. Again, here we are in 2024 anticipating that there's going to be an insurgence of biblical teaching in classrooms, not about the Bible, but from the Bible. And this happens here in Midnight Mass. There's a point when Father Paul claims that God has no country, and so we're doing this for the sake of religion, etc. By the end, the horror on display is very clear, and that the church is using the horror to grasp the power of the island, I think is salient, and it's profound. And I think it shows what's happening here in the United States. So if there's a connection to Christian nationalism, it's right here. The use of religion and the manipulation of people with good intentions to side with horrific things for the sake of power. There's one point at the end that feels so sad to me. Bev looks at somebody that has become like a kind of acolyte of the angelic being, the vampire, Sturge. And she goes, "Why'd you bring this guy back? He didn't ever come to Mass." And Sturge says, "He was nice to me. I thought this was a good thing." But it's not, because the monstrous image is not about bringing grace, freedom, or prosperity to all people. It's about taking power away from those who oppose it. But Sturge there just seems like a genuinely nice person. The manipulation of somebody like Sturge to be part of this horrific thing that is taking by gruesome violence the power structure of the island, I think is very close to what's happening here. So I'm going to throw it back to you, Jeff, to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying there. I think that's really on point to think about how this series, this island, is a microcosm of how we're seeing religion and nationalism weaponized, and good people like Sturge who get caught up in it, who maybe didn't grasp the full intent of what they were getting into, or the full scope of what they were getting into. Beverly Keane, you're right. Like, she is fantastic, very much in line with another sort of villainous female character we've talked about on the show, Mrs. Carmody from The Mist. You know, Flanagan is probably getting inspired by a number of different things, but if he is a Stephen King fan, and I think that's probably not a large claim there, I think that's probably pretty obvious that he's a Stephen King fan. He's informing all of his characters with some of King's greatest hits, and Mrs. Carmody from The Mist and Beverly Keane could be sisters from other misters, as it were. Like with Salem's Lot, we have this returning home trope going on with Riley, coming back into something that you left, coming back into something after time has passed. There's complications as to why Riley left. There's definitely complications as to why he's coming back. And his relationship with Father Paul is, to me, really interesting throughout the entirety. You know, am I reading into it? I mean, maybe. Am I committing the sin of shipping, as they would say in the fan fiction universe, where you're putting two different characters into a relationship? I don't think so. Like, I think there is some weird kind of tension between Father Paul and Riley. So that's ongoing. So much so that Father Paul creates a private Alcoholics Anonymous group for Riley on the island, so he doesn't have to go anywhere anymore. The Anne Rice vampire-y sexual tension there, perhaps. The fact that Hamish Linklater is a very attractive man and much younger than the older Monsignor probably helps as well. And you're right. Like, he does such a great job playing this role. He is super charismatic. He is whether, an actor or not, as he's acting in this series, a great preacher. Inspirational, uses the rhetorical elements of preaching to his strength to talk about the Bible, to convince everyone else that the vampire is an angel, using literalism to say, like, the people were terrified of the angel, like, and there's different types of terror, right? There's different ways of something to be awesome. Maybe there's some conflation there. One thing I want to talk about, though, that you brought up, when Monsignor is going to the Holy Land, when he's, gets lost in a crypt or something. If we're thinking about Christian nationalism, what's the thing that Christian nationalists are all super concerned with beyond blood, land, and purity? It's the Holy Land. They all want to go back to the Holy Land because, of course, this is where we will somehow trigger the second coming and the end of days, and all the prophecies will be fulfilled. And apparently that's a good thing because the world ends and we're raptured away. I don't know what happens at that point. The series kind of plays into that because he's in the Holy Land and he's looking for something. And what he finds is not what he's looking for, but he's so set on finding it that no matter what he finds was going to be that thing. And so then this allows for the vampire, which is the vampire, as we talked about in the cold open. It's like a parasitic type creature. it's just too on the nose in some ways, like where he finds the vampire and brings it back to the island. And he's like, hey, I brought the enemy in with me. And so it's the exact political allegory we're living through at this very moment. It's crazy, right? Yeah, you have that element going on. One other thing I wanted to say about, you were talking about how we're now bringing the Bible into schools. One of the best takedowns of that argument about, well, you don't want people to share their religious beliefs. And it's like, no, it is by Sheriff Hassan, when he talks, because Sheriff Hassan is a Muslim, as Brian pointed out. He talks about our Muslims, our religion, he's speaking from his perspective, also believe in Jesus. We also believe in the Bible, and we read the Bible, but we're not teaching the Bible. We read it as a text. And there's a level of nuance, even just for like what might be a throwaway scene for some people, that I really appreciate, because you can't get anyone in our current political landscape to articulate that point. It's not that we don't want people to read the Bible. It's not that we don't want people to read the Bible in schools. It's that people shouldn't be indoctrinated to, this is the only religious text that you should believe in. And that's the way, at least in places like Louisiana and Texas, that they're going to be teaching the Bible. They're not going to be reading the Bible like, I remember in high school, in a public school here in Altoona, we read part of the Old Testament in 11th grade English class. We read the book of Ruth. So shout out to Mrs. Suter if you're still out there somewhere. Where we taught that this is supposed to be a religious text you live by. No, we read it as a story, because as it turns out, the Bible is a book filled with stories. And the stories aren't history. They are parables, and they are examples or allegories of how people dealt with things, and how then maybe you too can think about dealing with things. Like, that's how religion works. And that's fundamentally what's misunderstood in this country, but definitely on this island, because Bev Keane is one of these people who wants to nail up the 10 Commandments in the classroom and just make it seem like this is historical fact, and this is how we go forward. And if you don't believe this, there's the last ferry out. And so, until we shut them down, of course. So, Brian, I'll turn it back to you here.
Yeah, I think all of what you're saying is really important. That scene where they're discussing whether or not the Bible should be taught in class, again, teachings of the Bible, not the Bible being taught, is important for the reasons you just said. I think what's incredible about that is that when the sheriff starts talking about the Quran and the use of the Bible and even the love of Jesus in the religion of Islam, he gets Bev to say, oh, I don't think that this is a time where we should talk about our religious differences or our religious convictions. And he goes, exactly. That's my point. Exactly. Right. He gets Bev to make the point for her that this is not the place to do those things, to identify and argue and attempt to create a situation where somebody has to accept a religious belief. And I think the second part is, like you're saying, what is also, I think, very compelling about this show is that it's never the case that Christianity as such is bad. I don't think that the creator of the show, Mike Flanagan, and all the other writers took it on themselves to say, oh, what we should be doing is rejecting Christianity. We have multiple iterations of Christianity working out. Erin Green, played by Kate Siegel, for example, is a version of that, where as soon as she sees what's going on, she rejects this idea that we should be adopting the horror of this angelic, vampiric being. The Christianity is okay. Christian nationalism is not okay. That's a callback to our Christian nationalism conversation. But a callback to our religious horror conversation, and even to the worry about Salem's Lot. We don't get a lot of mythology about the vampire angel in Midnight Mass, but we get a lot of it in Roman Catholicism, in Christianity. So already we have a mythology accepted because that's such a clear part of it. And contrary to something like Salem's Lot or to Dracula, it's very clear that there's no negative response by the vampire to the cross. So that whole part of the story gets subverted. And I think that's really important too, because the thing that happens with the mixing of blood is an inversion of the worry that shows up in Dracula. If part of Dracula's worry is about the impurity and the mixing of blood by an outsider, here we get the mixing of blood as an evangelical tool.
How else does gospel spread?
What am I going to do? I'm going to drink your blood and you're going to drink my blood. And that's how we're going to evangelize. It seems as though, right, so at one point, I think this is episode 5, Bev says something like, how else do we spread the gospel? And that's an echo of Father Paul. How else do we spread the gospel? But by letting people go and doing these horrific things. So this is an inversion of the initial worry of Dracula for the sake of spreading our ideology, our vampirism out into the world. And I think that's important. The last thing I'll say, I think you're right that that connection at the AA meetings is interesting and compelling. There's something very interesting that happens with Riley. He is an alcoholic, and that's why he ends up crashing his car, killing a person, spending time in jail. He goes to the AA meetings, and he works on himself. In virtue ethics, we talk a lot about bringing under the guidance of reason one's desires or passions. So you have to take your desires and put them under the guidance of reason. And in many ways, it seems as though Riley is attempting to do that. But when people are infected, is that what we call it? Infected by the vampire, they have an overriding desire for blood. And so at the end of episode 5, again, this is spoiler, I know, Riley Flynn becomes a vampire and takes Erin out on a boat and resists the urge to drink her blood and sacrifices himself. I think the AA meetings set that up as Riley being a virtuous person in this moment. He is putting under the guidance of his reason, his desire for the blood of another human being, and that showcases something that's different than a lot of the other people on the island. Immediately, the desire for blood seems to take over, and they don't have that sense of putting passions or desires under the guidance of one's reason. So that Alcoholic Anonymous part, I think, is incredibly important for the building of Riley's character and how that shows a difference between him and the rest of the community. So I think those are my thoughts on this. I mean, I would love to talk about this for a long time. I think that's what I wanted to say. Did you have more thoughts, final thoughts? And of course, you can lead us into the conversation about joy.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, so looking at how they, or like you said, invert the Dracula story, right? Like they take this idea of inversion and they are using it then as a way of making sense of this vampiric behavior within the realm of Catholicism, within the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, where, you know, during the sacrament, the wine actually becomes the literal blood. This gets back to what we were talking about with Chris, maybe to bring us full circle for a moment, where in many ways, the figure of Dracula is a mirror image of Christ. We talked about that with Chris a bit, where Bram Stoker, when he was creating Dracula, was thinking about Dracula as a Christ, but a few things were wrong. And this just maybe a shout out to my English 200 students right now. We're in a lit theory class. We were talking about Lacan and psychoanalysis. And one of Lacan's concepts in psychoanalysis is this relationship between the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The imaginary is what we have in our heads, like how we perceive things. The symbolic is how we communicate them, whether that be spoken word or written word or visual media, whatever. And then the real is the thing itself. And you can go back to Plato for forms if you want to go back to maybe what's inspiring psychoanalysis and Lacan here, but whatever. We're not a philosophy podcast yet. We're getting there. Maybe we should be. But this is very much an exploration of that concept of psychoanalysis of the real. So what is the real? How do we get back to the real? And how are we as humans fundamentally or inherently or preternaturally unable to get to the real? And what horrors, what problems, what issues arise when we assume we know what the real is and try to tell others? I'll go back to what I said with Father Paul. When he comes back with a vampire, he assumes it's an angel because he wants it to be an angel. He wants his faith to be confirmed, and he will follow whatever this angel tells him because he's never experienced the real angel before. His only experience of the angel is through the symbolic, which is to say through people writing about angels in the Bible. If any of us saw an angel, would we really know? Maybe that's too much of an existential question to end an episode on, but we would know we saw a being that's supernatural. We would know if we saw a being surrounded by great light. Could it be an alien just as easily as an angel? Could the alien, and this gets to, again, a Christian nationalism issue, if those are the angels in our sphere, in our existence, if we shut all people who are different than us out, is that refusing angels? Maybe this isn't related to Salem's Lot. Maybe this is too related to our current political moment, but these are questions that I think are worth investigating, but maybe a little dark. So with that being said, let's bring this around to joy and where we see joy coming out of these texts, coming out of the StokerVerse, coming out of Salem's Lot, and coming out of Midnight Mass. Brian, I'll start if you don't mind. I just getting to finally experience Salem's Lot, very joyful. Being able to read it and think about characters that don't all look like a bad Beach Boys ad from the 60s and the made-for-TV version movie. That's joyful because that casting, God, like, was it only Scandinavian, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people from, like, would be in a Hitler Youth video? It was, I don't know, never really enjoyed that movie. So the book, so much better. Glad I read it. Great. Another universe I want to sit with. I'm super joyful that I can see more Father Callahan in the Dark Tower series. So maybe that's next on the Audible listening. Oh, by the way, Audible, if you're listening to us, which would be ironic, wouldn't it? We're still looking for sponsors here on Horror Joy. So give us some of those Bezos bucks. So Other Joy, Midnight Mass. I mean, happy I got to finally see this movie. The acting in this series is great. I think it's criminal that none of these folks were nominated for any awards because it was really well acted, really well done. If you haven't watched it, go out and enjoy it. I love how all three of the texts, if we think about StokerVerse, broadly speaking, as a text, have made us think about conceptions of Dracula and how vampires are still a very useful way of thinking about our cultural norms and mores and the issues therein. So to me, again, maybe nerdy professor alert sounder, whatever we're doing at this point, to me, that's a lot of fun. That's a lot of joy. That's what I like to do when I'm thinking about texts and media. So Brian, the joy for you in these three different media.
Yeah, so one thing I do want to say is I think that it's important that Father Paul is an insider, right? So we get the revelation that he has come back to the island. And to your point, I think that's really important because I don't think that the community would have accepted him if he were an outsider. Again, going back to that inside-outside, worry about the alien, worry about the intruder, worry about the illegal person coming into our society. So I think that's actually a really important part of it. But in terms of joy, there's lots here. Revisiting both Salem's Lot and Midnight Mass was incredibly enjoyable. I really like both of these things, both of these worlds. Talking to Chris, something that we talked about is the opening of worlds through gameplay, but also through any interaction with art. And I think that that's important. I think that what this has done is opened up a world. We live in the world beyond the pages and beyond the screen. And that's something that I find incredible joy. I take up the world. I am part of the generativity of that world, and it's part of the generativity of my world, right? And I think that is exciting and incredibly joyful. I also think that we have zoomed in many ways. Dracula begins, it's intercontinental in many ways. You have the Texan, you have people from the UK, you have people from Eastern Europe and Western Europe, all kind of meeting together. This is a big world that we're dealing with in Dracula, and therefore in the StokerVerse. I think we zoom into Salem's Lot. This is America, but this is mainland America. And now we're zooming in even farther to an island community that does not have an outside. It is very insular, and we zoom into this one island, and it simplifies the story, and it tells this incredible story about alcohol and religion and insiders and outsiders and our understanding of other religions and all of that stuff, right? It's incredibly rich in this kind of zoomed in mode, and seeing how all of these things connect is joyful. Finally, if you haven't seen Heretic, I highly recommend it. It deals in belief. And I think that one thing that I really like about the story of Midnight Mass is that it tells the story about insidious Christianity. And here we're linking it to Christian nationalism without making the broader judgment that all Christianity is bad. It doesn't say that all Christianity is good. It doesn't make any judgments, but it never kind of just derides Christianity or religion generally as a bad thing. And I think that's a hard kind of line to walk. So that was a joyful thing for me to watch somebody do that so intelligently with such great acting, such great storytelling. Really good. Any final thoughts, Jeff?
No, I mean, again, like a lot of joy to be had here and a lot of things just to consider and think about, how do we be outsiders? What do we do with inside versus outside communities? And how do we avoid horrors like we see in some of these texts? That's it.
Yeah, I think that's all fair. So much, I think, to continue to talk about, so much to continue to think about, and I'm sure that we'll get more vampires along the way. I want to say that we are now on Threads. We are now on Blue Sky. Please find us there, follow us there, like us there. As always, find joy, even in horror. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.